welcome to Swalif with me, Hamad Amari, a monthly program hosted on the US Embassy here in Doha, where I get to learn about so many things. Our first episode was about volunteerism. You can check that out on the YouTube channel. But today, it's all about the most important thing that's happening in the world right now, which is US elections. And I am honored and humbled to have Dr. Amel Ahmed, who will be discussing her area of expertise with us this evening, or for us it's evening, and for you, Dr. Ahmed, it is afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you. So let's just start the chat. I don't want this to be an interview. I'm going to use this as an opportunity for me to learn, and I want people watching to learn with me and alongside me. And after we upload this when it's edited, the learning will continue. So briefly, just tell us about yourself and your why you are the person who is talking to us about this today.
So I am a associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I study democratization, voting systems, elections, voting rights, legislatures, and I study this historically and in comparison with other countries. I focus mostly on the United States and Europe, but I've written about other parts of the world as well. And I'm most interested in how parties interact with electoral systems and how we get the results that we do. So I think that's my official background. And probably why I'm here talking to you today.
Excellent. And let's have the audience understand more about your background, yourself as an individual. You are an Arab American.
I'm Arab American, Egyptian American. I have lived in the US most of my life, but I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. I spend a lot of time in Egypt. It is not the area of my research, but it's an area that I care about very much. I also enjoy spending time there. And yeah, we spend most summers in Cairo.
Oh, nice.
So I have strong connections to the Middle East and to the Arab American and Muslim American community here in the US.
Lovely. I've never been to I've been to Egypt once, actually, and I went there to play golf. You wouldn't think it to look at me, would you?
That would not be the first place I would think of for golf, but
See?
you can find everything in Egypt.
Yeah, see, your reaction says it all. I don't know if it was about Egypt or about me playing golf, whichever one the reaction was. But yeah, it was a long time ago, but a wonderful place nonetheless. It has a lot of history and a lot of, important city. There's a lot of Egyptians here in Qatar as well, and they're part of our community here. And a big part of why I wanted to do Swalif is there's a lot of things that we can learn about. And the US Embassy I've always wanted to be able to have conversations, because I feel like having an attention span to a lecture or to an institution saying something is quite deterring sometimes. So I'm a chatty man. I like to have conversations, and I try and add value through these conversations. And one big important thing that we have here is the US elections. I mean, it affects the whole world, and it is obviously very important to the region, the results. And we are always, it's like we go through our own election fever here, But I am a witness to very different rooms and social gatherings, and I start to listen. And from what I understand, it seems to me, and I'm not judging, but it seems to me from where I'm sitting, that there's a lot of missing pieces that are not communicated to a lot of people. We get it from the traditional media that's doing their business and doing their job and getting the views that they need to get, you know what I mean? Whatever way they want to do it. But for me, I just want to start with who can become president of the United States. Let's start there. Like, is it anyone who is American, or are there, what are the prerequisites?
So thank you. First, I'd say I love the conversation. I am also looking to learn from you because I speak to US audiences mostly. So I'm not sure what the missing parts are, or what parts are not clear to an audience that isn't familiar and isn't constantly looking at these elections. So first point, the US presidency is open to any native-born U.S. citizen. So you have to have been born in the United States to be president. But any native-born U.S. citizen over the age of 35 is eligible to run and be a candidate for president.
But you can only be 35 to be president. And if you were born in the U.S., lived somewhere else, and came back, you're still eligible.
I believe if you're born to U.S. citizen parents, and so as long as you're not a naturalized citizen, I believe you're eligible.
Okay. So why can you start voting at 18? If it's, do you see what I mean?
This is like... the voting age has changed. There's not an obvious answer for that. I think that's a good question. Okay. And I think ultimately these things are tied to other political forces, and what moved the voting age to 18. I think it was higher and then it was moved down. A lot of times it's tied to when people are considered adult enough to have a job, or adult enough to serve in the military, for example. I think military service is always a big reason that countries push for the vote. Historically, in the United States and in Europe, working class voters became enfranchised at times of war, because you're sending them off to fight wars. You need to at least give them the vote. And so 18 in the United States right now is considered the age of adulthood, where you're no longer bound to your parents, you're no longer families are no longer required to keep you in school. So 18 in general is considered the age of adulthood. But why? I think that's usually tied to other political forces, either the workforce or military service for the most part.
Okay, cool. There are so many things before getting into the office. You know, there's stages of qualification, if you want to call it that. Do you have to have a political affiliation? Do you have to have political history or diplomatic history, or can you be a citizen who gathers the most votes? How does it work, and where do you start? And let's go from the basics.
So technically there are no qualifications. There's no formal qualifications, but technically is one thing and politically is another. So what is your likelihood of success, for example, if you are not coming through one of the major parties? Very low in the political system that we have in place. In most mass participatory democracies, that's what we refer to the US and these large countries that are democratic. We're talking about mass participation. And for that, we usually rely on parties to structure competition and to give voters a signal or indication of who is in their interest, and to organize politics. So if you're not coming through one of these major parties, your likelihood of success is very low. Now we have third-party challengers very often. We see third-party candidates in the United States. Very often they are competing for symbolic value, to get a message through, or even to lobby one of the major parties to say, look, we've got this much support, we've got this many votes, we want you to take these issues into consideration. So that's where you typically get third-party challengers. But for the most part, individuals running for elections in a democracy or a country of 300 million, your likelihood of success is really low. So it's not really a technical qualification, but it's a political qualification to have had experience within your party organization. And different posts will require different things, even different election years. This election, for example, there wasn't a lot of attention to foreign policy. In previous elections, foreign policy credentials were really important. This year, the focus was on, of course, the coronavirus and on the economy, and those two things are related. So I think that was the real emphasis. So in every election, the qualifications or the things that voters and parties are going to be most focused on is going to be different.
Just interesting on a point that you said that, it's a 4-year term, and this year being, I understand that we're all going through around the world through COVID, and it's unprecedented, and the difficulties and challenges it's given the whole world. But yes, it's serious, but it's a 4-year term. So is the COVID, was it that, how big was it? Was it an anchor for something that, we're hearing every other day that a new vaccine is here or over there, or at least the ball is moving and there is momentum towards getting that kind of thing solved. So if this is something that's steering a lot of people, if it's a big deal for 2020, in a 4-year term, what would it look like? Or is there other
So
things?
let me ask you first, when you say this is a 4-year term, is that, in your mind, is that short or long?
I mean, it's short, to be honest, for me, but in 4 years, to have something, to have something that when you say COVID was something that is on the, in the economy, is a factor in deciding the next US president.
Yes.
It's 4 years. If this is something that is going to be factored in the next 2 years, 3 years, it's not, to me, there are bigger things that could push someone into the office of the president, for example, over a 4-year course. It's not just the heat of the moment economy and COVID today, because it's the biggest thing that's happening.
Well, realistically, I mean, 4 years is a short term. And for most presidential candidates, most of what they're promising can't actually even be delivered in 4 years. And I think there was an interesting study came out recently that says that parties need to be in place for 3 terms. So one president can't be in place for more than 2 terms, but a party would have to be in place for 3 terms to enact most of the policies that they're talking about. Now, COVID is different. And I think the reason COVID took such important significance is the urgency and the fact that in the United States, this has really become quite a crisis, and it's spreading faster than we can handle it. And the response, a lot of people feel, has been inadequate. There hasn't been adequate coordination. And these are things that the office of the president is uniquely situated to resolve. A lot of the problems early on were with testing, and that, testing was supply chain issue, and those supply chains are international, and you need the president and the office of the presidency to facilitate those things. So I think there's a real sense of urgency. I hope that the COVID crisis doesn't last over 4 years. I think we all hope that.
Amen.
But I think in order for it to not last those 4 years, we need someone who's going to take action right away. And of course, responding to COVID also presents challenges to the economy. So I think voters were very focused on how these 2 things are going to be balanced and calibrated, and can we get through the public health crisis without decimating the economy. And there was real disagreement on which candidate was going to handle this better.
I want to take it back to one thing you said earlier about the third party, and then the 2-party system that you have. You said that you want democratic countries to engage in, have some kind of guidelines as to how to engage, and that every now and then there is a third party, and sometimes they would, lobby one of the 2 bigger parties. Is the system in place now, in its most robust form, not allowing room for a third party? Would any third party that comes in just be engulfed in one of the big parties, and that's why it's always the two parties? And why have we not seen a race of 3? Why is it always 2?
Terrific question. And I think this is an area that people have researched extensively, and the finding is very strong that the kind of election system we have in the United States, majority system, winner take all system, will really only support 2 parties. So there are other systems. A lot of European democracies have proportional representation, and there you see multiple parties. You can see, there are a lot of smaller parties, but in a typical PR system, you'll see at least 5, 6 really competitive parties. So the system will support it. For a system like the United States, it really won't support more than 2 parties. And a lot of it has to do with the logic of competition and how you'll be rewarded. So when a candidate or a party or any organization decides that they want to be involved in politics, they want to make sure that the effort that they're investing will be rewarded. And with something like the presidency, there's only 1 seat, there's only 1 reward, and 1 party is going to get 100% of that. So if you don't think that you have a good chance, and close to 50% chance that you're going to get that one seat, then it might make more sense to lobby one of the other parties, to join one of the other parties, to form a political action committee and to push for the policies that you want. Those are the kinds of things that might reward the effort more than really competing at a national level for just one seat. Now, that doesn't mean parties don't change. So we haven't had the same parties in place for the whole history of the United States. You do get third-party challengers, and they can last for a short period. But after that short period, either they're going to be engulfed into one of the dominant parties, or they will replace one of the dominant parties. But it's really, really unusual in a system like we have in the United States and elsewhere, where you have winner take all, very unusual to see three competitive parties over a long period of time.
So it's very clear that the system as it is now is, you know, it is what it is as of today, and this is what we're working with. And where I hear you talking about policies and changing laws and getting your policies across, and it seems that it's not always at the top. It's not the Oval Office that's, you know, putting these things in place. Where does the competition begin? At what stage? You know, which parties, is it at a state level, and then over time it becomes, when it becomes elections, you have the red and blue states? Is that, am I seeing it in the right way, or is there a lot more to it that I'm not getting?
Well,
Excuse
tell
me,
me.
I have a little cold, but I'm safe. I promise.
But we're at a safe distance, so it's okay.
Yeah. Very safe distance. It doesn't get safer than this.
So help me understand again what parts are not filled in here. Where does the competition for what start? For seats, for policies, for?
So the reason to go into politics is because you have something in your mind that you want to get across. You have a mission. You're not, you know, if you like fame or something, maybe, I don't know, but ideally it's, you have something that you want to get done. There's something that needs to change in your community or in your state or in your borough, or what levels are there? Because we hear about senates, we hear about councils, we hear about, you know, like what layers are there in government? So you have, in each place, in each state, there's seats and numbers and
Yes.
all of these things pour into towards the end to one big pot, if you want to call it that, right? And does it always mean that you have to, is everyone in it trying to be president, or is the system getting, you know, it's a party versus a party, so it's our mission versus their mission, our objectives versus their objectives, and at what level does that begin to happen?
I'd say most people start at the most local level. And the reason for that is what you need to succeed for the most part in politics are money and endorsements. Right? So you need money to be competitive, and you need people to support you. And most people, so the money part, maybe you're independently wealthy and you don't need the party's money, but not everyone is a Michael Bloomberg who can self-fund their own campaign. So if you're in that position, good for you. Maybe you can jump a few steps ahead. Maybe you don't have to start at the most local level. But the reason people start, I mean, even more local than states, they start in municipal government or in local government boards, because then they build up a reputation, and maybe that reputation carries them to the next level, and they compete for state legislatures. And maybe that reputation carries them to the next level, and they start getting more endorsements and more support, get the attention of their state party. And maybe they run for governor, or maybe they go for national representation in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. Now, the thing about the United States is, because it's a federal system, there are effectively two tracks, and those tracks can come together at certain points. One track is to focus on your state, focus on state legislatures, focus on maybe the governorship of your state. It's an executive position that's very powerful. The United States, lots of responsibilities are placed within the state itself. So that's one track. The other track is to focus on national government and maybe run for a seat in the House of Representatives, maybe run for a seat in the Senate. National politics tend to be more costly and more resource intensive. They require a lot more support. So if you think you can be competitive, oftentimes parties will recruit you. If they see candidates who they think are going to be competitive, the parties will do some recruiting for seats that are available. And those tracks can join in. So some governors end up running for president. You don't have to be stuck in one track or another. But the idea is that for the most part, you need to build up a reputation, which is why by the time people get to the Senate or to the presidency, very often they end up being older. Very rarely do we see candidates who are running for president at the age of 35, even though technically they can. It takes time to build up those relationships and to get the confidence of a major party behind you.
That's a lot to take in. I don't know. I mean, you said it so, and I'm like, I'm trying to take notes, and so I understand
We
now
can
that
go back.
three branches of, there's these three tracks. You could either be a governor, or be in the Senate, or be in the House of Representatives. What's the difference between the Senate and the House of Representatives? So each state has a seat in the Senate, and then you have the governor of the state, and then there's a House of Representatives.
So let's describing them as tracks maybe is what's confusing. So let's go back. Let's call them two levels. The first level is the state level. And I mean, consider two levels. It's a federal system. So the first level is the state level, and the other level is the national level. Okay. So you have state legislatures, and then you have the national legislature. Okay. The national legislative branch is the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it's national because even though they're representing states, they are making federal policy. They're making national policy instead of policy just for the states. Okay. So each state has its own state legislature, and that state legislature is making policy for that state. But they also send representatives to the House, and the representatives for the House are chosen according to the number of people in the state. So different states have a different number of representatives. And then representatives in the Senate are fixed. Every state gets 2 senators, no matter the size of the state. Okay.
All right. So at a state level, it's not always the best thing to be the head of your state, to be the governor, in order to become. It doesn't. I mean, there's a lot of factors, but is it having better political experience in federal legislation over state legislation or state related affairs? Does that give you more clout? Does that give you more, oomph politically, where you can, you know how to bob and weave within that system?
So I would have to look historically to see, but I feel like I'm pretty sure there are a lot of governors that have gone on to the presidency. So I don't necessarily think that that's the case, because it's, aside from the presidency, it's the only other executive office that you can have, meaning outside. So you are a commander-in-chief of your state. So for a lot of parties and voters, that does give you really solid experience. As governor, what you would lack often is foreign policy experience, for trade experience, things like that. Although there are governors that negotiate trade agreements and things like that. But I would say probably the 2 most common professions leading into the presidency are either governor or senator.
Okay, we're doing okay for time.
Okay.
There's, in this election that just gone, there was 3 days where the magical number was not reached, and every time I went into a majlis is where the bros hang out, or the big dogs hang out. Depending on if I'm wearing this into a majlis, this is big dog majlis. When the bros, everything's chilling. So when we go in and the number hasn't changed, and of course the magical number I'm talking about is 270, and it was very close between Biden and Trump, where we had those 3 days of the count, and Pennsylvania and Nevada, and at this time, I hear in the majlis everyone talking about the number, and whoever I explained to give me the number, I never got an answer. So I'm hoping that you can decrypt this number for us. What is the significance of 270, and how many seats make up these votes, and what is the Electoral College? Like, you know?
So I'm going to answer the easiest question first, and then we
Okay.
can go to the harder ones.
Okay.
270 is easy. 270 is a majority of the Electoral College votes.
Okay.
So there are 538 votes altogether. And 538 is the number of votes in each state added up. Each state
Okay.
gets a number of Electoral College votes equal to its congressional delegation. And what that means, the congressional delegation is its national congressional delegation, the number of representatives it has in the House of Representatives, plus the number of senators.
Okay. But so
So,
that's the two senators from every state, definitely guaranteed every time.
yes,
And then on the national representation, so
yes,
in the federal arm, it would be the how many representatives they have in the House of Representatives.
yes.
Okay.
So the state of Pennsylvania, where there was a lot of attention focused, has 20 Electoral College votes. That means they have 18 representatives in the House of Representatives plus 2 senators. So that gives them 20 votes in the Electoral College. And so it's roughly proportional to population, but adding in the 2 Senate votes creates a little bit of disproportionality. But so what we were waiting for with that 270 is there were too many states that were too close to be able to award their Electoral College votes. And that's what we waited for many days, refreshing our browsers repeatedly.
Yeah. I mean, I was refreshing everything. Every feed, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it was, and obviously all the media outlets here. One thing I do want to talk about is media, and I know that's not in your field of, you haven't. It's not something that you'd be. I mean, it plays a huge role, and I'm
Yes.
sure if you've studied it, if you studied the democratic process, and I mean, media is huge. It's huge. It's where all of our eyes are fixed on. It's different narratives coming at you now, and with social media, it's just kind of all over the place. The amount of notifications you get, and this, we've seen how powerful this medium can be, and the conventional media is also just hungry for the views and pushing constantly, and we're always looking at all screens constantly. Who's got the latest update, who's got the latest news. How important is that for the democratic process in America right now? Is the media playing a vital role, or is it just is most of the votes coming from the democratic process that we've explained now with the regional? They start with their states and move forward kind of as they go, but media is definitely something that is. I mean, we were all glued to it for 3 days trying to wait for this number to change. And the point I want to make is asking my friends here, majority did not know what Electoral College was even. So they just knew that there's a number there. So the point is, media is saying something, but the actual education of the masses viewing is not there. That education isn't coming across for someone to have to kind of go, okay, what is an Electoral College? And understand that this Electoral College is numbers, but what is it? What is its significance? Where did it come from? That stuff isn't communicated in the media. For us, it's just, boom, here it is, you know it. If you don't know it, the magic number is 270. And it was like, that it has that media, newsy, clicky, baity kind of, everyone watch me, 270,
So it's not just you. There are a lot of people here who don't understand where that 270 comes from or how the Electoral College works. So let me say first on the media quickly, because I do want to go back to you've asked twice now about the Electoral College, so we'll go back to that. But the media, absolutely vital. So one of the things that became very clear in this election is that we have these news flashes that CNN projects this state for this candidate. That is really just the media. I mean, they have their own statisticians. They have very, strong data analytics professionals who are very focused on this, and they have their formulas that allow them to do those projections. but there's no state or government official that's projecting this. This is really just the role of the media. And so this year, it was a really big challenge, and there was a lot of work done. I work with different organizations of political scientists and people who study elections, working with the media to explain this process and why it was, everybody knew it was going to drag out because of the issue of mail-in votes, because it was going to take longer for those to process. And every state was going to be different because every state has different rules about when votes can be counted, how long the votes can be accepted. Every state is going to be different because it's part of the federal system that we have states decide on the rules that govern election administration. So there was a lot of work that was done with the media to explain, we know that you're used to big election night, you know, maybe we go a little into the middle of the night, but we have some big blowout event, and then there's an acceptance speech, a victory speech, and a concession speech. But we were not expecting it this year. So there was a lot of work with the media, and I think they did handle it well to explain why it was taking longer and the fact that we hadn't reached this point. Now, the issue with the Electoral College, you want me to, I'll jump in.
Yeah, please. I mean, you've raised, I mean, every time you say something, there's always flags going up, but I'll let you get into
It's
the
a conversation, so we can just go.
Yeah. I mean, just now you're talking about the role, and two questions. What happens now in terms of the mailing ballots and things like that? So one thing we talked about earlier was COVID, this being the year of COVID. The private sector and what's been created in terms of contact tracing applications and understanding, protecting your distancing and all of that. There's a lot of push to get that done and try and create safer environments. And there's a lot of tech and information and personal data that is exchanged and encrypted and making sure everyone's safe without getting people's data, without making people feel like, you know, it's too big brother, but we're actually there for your safety. But at the foundation of it all is that we know where people are. We know if they have symptoms. We know that they're moving around. We identify their age, their location, their interest. All of this information is available today on so many items of tech and consumable things of tech that we use, whether it's social media or different applications. Yet in the election process this year, it's using the United States Postal Service. How is it that this is still, how is there not a vote from home or is it legislation that's stopping that? Is it innovation what needs to happen? Or do you think do you see this happening in the future where people can vote from home and vote from their device? Or, you know, where is it, this physical, I need to go in and I need to fill out the form, or now fill it out and send it in the post? Are we not in the time, in an era of paperless and communication and all of that? Yet one of the biggest things deciding in the world, the president of the United States, is done through post and manual. Why? Where are we? What's going on there? Like,
So two things. Because there were a lot of people who said exactly what you're saying very early on. Said, let's just move to electronic voting. This will be much easier, safer. Everyone can do it from home. Two problems there. The first is logistical. That election administration, just the process of conducting an election, is really complicated, and it relies on state infrastructure that doesn't maneuver very easily. Right. So these things, they're not. People have done
bureaucracy. What you're saying is it?
Yeah, there's a bureaucracy in place that is accustomed to doing things a certain way, and we knew that it would have to change for this election, but it had to change in a very, very short amount of time. So the expectation that states, and again, it's every different state that's going to do it according to their own regulations. There wasn't a lot of support coming from the federal government. There wasn't a lot of money going into this. So shifting to electronic voting very quickly when it had not been tried before in the United States That seemed very risky. And a lot of election experts, some of them did propose this, but the fact that it wasn't used before was the major limitation. Even for mail-in voting, even though that it has been used, there are, I think, 4 or 5 states that only use mail-in voting. But these states took years to get to that point. And we were talking about months. We had months to shift to a different voting system. So 2 things that came to mind. First of all, we know what mail-in voting looks like. We know what it looks like elsewhere. We know what some of the legal challenges to mail-in voting are. So in my mind, that seemed like a better way to proceed, knowing that there were going to be questions in people's mind about how legitimate this method of voting is. This is something that we can point to other states and say, Colorado has done this, Utah has done this, and they've done it effectively. They know how to do it. They can share that knowledge with us. In contrast to trying a completely new system that hasn't been tried before in the United States, even if we can, show that we have the data security infrastructure to protect the vote, it's going to be questionable whether or not states can implement it. And the most important thing in any sort of democratic outcome is how confident people are in the results. Do people have confidence that this is a valid result? And with mail-in voting, I don't think we should question the USPS, the United States Postal Service. I think they've done an amazing job with it. But the most important thing is there are ballots. You can go back and you can count them again. If you're not sure, you go back and count them again and again. That's different from trying to follow a internet connection to verify a vote. So there's only so much that you can push people to accept a new system. And this was just too quick a turnaround. In the future, maybe. In the future, if people gain confidence in this, and you seem very confident and tech savvy, I don't think most
I'm not tech savvy at all. I just feel like at a point in my life where I can get a taxi using my phone to take me anywhere. I can book appointments for my kids. I can book tickets. I can book holidays. I can do everything I want on one device. And I can get food delivered to me, medicine delivered to me, my prescription. Depending on where you are in the world today, all of these tech services are there for you. And it's coming from the US. That's why it's like it's Silicon Valley.
So I would say the one difference between those examples is you're referring all to personal services and not a public good that can be contested. So personal services, you can take your risk.
Okay, I see which door you want to come in from. Let's go.
Okay. So for your personal services, you can take whatever risk you want. Maybe your Uber shows up, you can take that risk. But if we're talking about a public outcome where people might challenge you and say, no, that vote doesn't actually exist, or no, that vote didn't actually land. I think most people want something much more concrete to be able to refer back to. So we might take risk with our own data, with our own information, but as in terms of a public outcome that really the legitimacy of democracy hinges on.
Yeah, okay.
Personally, I recommend it against electronic balloting. And even, we didn't have all mail-in votes. Even it was a combination. It was a hybrid strategy aimed at reducing the pressure on election day voting, making sure that you had large enough facilities that people can social distance and have enough space to do it safely. So the goal was really to reduce the pressure of election day and not revolutionize the technology of voting. But I'm sure that's not too far off. The more we trust it.
I'm sure. No, one thing it's interesting that you said to me is the logistics. I didn't know that it was, I'm here to learn. As I said from the start, I want to know a lot about everything that's happening everywhere, which is, I've still got about 30 years left of my life. I think I can consume some kind of information. But it has to be there. But when you're saying it's a hybrid system, it means that there is willingness to get to, the sacred democracy, right? It's this model that is being exported and fought for, and the democratic, having democracy is something that is good, and keeping it, making sure that it's to the the statutes of what you have built in your. I mean, this is the system that's unique to America, right? This doesn't happen. Does this system happen anywhere else in the world, or is this a unique system to the United States?
Which system?
The voting system now. The electoral college system, the democratic system that's happening in the States.
The Electoral College as a way of electing the presidency, I don't believe any other country has this specific system. I think Argentina had it briefly and then got rid of it. So I would say it is very particular to the United States. So it gets a lot of attention because we don't see it anywhere else. But we have other mechanisms that serve a role of what I call consensus building for the executive, for the office of the presidency. We talk a lot about the Electoral College versus the popular vote, for example. The popular vote is really just the votes that people cast on election day or through the election process tallied up, and there's a majority winner and a minority winner. There are actually not very many countries that elect their presidents in that way, believe it or not. So it seems like the most obvious, most intuitive method of electing for a single office. But very often, not just the United States, but elsewhere, you try to build in consensus building mechanisms, specifically because it is just one seat. It's one seat that is going to govern an entire country. And so you want to make sure as much as possible that you're electing someone who's not just popular, very popular with this group or very popular with that group, but has the most appeal to the most audiences. And so that's something that the Electoral College does. We have other mechanisms. So France uses a runoff mechanism to kind of achieve the same thing. Parliamentary systems have their executive come straight out of parliament to make sure that they have that kind of consensus building effort for the office of the presidency. The Electoral College does something different. It does it, a little bit more clumsily, perhaps, but it's the same idea that you're trying to identify someone who has majority appeal in lots of different states, in lots of different contexts, and identify that person as the winner.
And this is one thing that always comes up in a conversation is popular versus electoral college, the popular vote. And for us, we're political only for that 2 months of the year, the rest of the year we're watching football or whatever it is. Just explain why it exists. I mean, if it's the idea is that the people will vote, so the most amount of people that pick this guy, automatically that wins. But that's not how it happens, right? It's you have this versus this. So let's just kind of very quickly try and explain that, because we're running out of time. There's a lot more questions.
So quickly,
I want to take questions from the audience as well.
So very quickly on the hardest question of the day.
No, take your time. Take your time. I really no. Seriously, okay. This is. I mean, yes, Electoral College. This is something that I just kind of need to know today.
So the Electoral College, there are two distinctive features of it as an electoral system. The first is that there are electors that are assigned to vote for president. So it's not directly the popular vote. There are electors that are assigned, and every state can assign them differently. Most states assign them based on the majority winner in that state. They identify electors to support the winner within their state. So there is a popular vote within states. It's not as if there's no popular vote at all, but it's not the national popular vote. It's the popular vote within the state.
Who picks the electors?
The electors are picked through, every state does it slightly differently, but typically through the party conventions and the state legislatures. They decide who will choose the electors. Now, in theory, the electors can, as it was originally written, the electors can act however they want. They can go with the popular vote winner or not. Now, that's really just in theory. There are very strong norms against electors acting however they want. And many states, I think almost most states have now put into law that electors have to follow the majority winner in their state. They have to vote for all of the electors. There are only 2 states that don't do it through winner take all, Nebraska and Maine. But the other states, most of them have put into law that the electors have to vote with the majority winner of that state. So the fact that you have electors is kind of, I think it's distracting for a lot of people, because at the end of the day, the electors aren't usually acting on their own. And the Supreme Court just upheld this issue, which is that states can force electors to vote for the majority winner of their states. So if we can put that feature aside, then what you have left is really all the electoral system, the Electoral College is a system of awarding, a system of awarding support based on the majority winner within states. So you're aggregating the votes at the level of the state. That means you're going to lose some proportionality in the outcome, but you will end up with a winner that has majority support in more states.
So you have, the law says that you have to vote for the majority of your state in some states, not all the states.
Yeah.
So, okay. So there could be a state that votes for one thing, but the Electoral College in there is leaning, and the law doesn't allow, you know, the electors to have to vote for the popular vote in their state. So the popular vote in that state could be Democratic, but the elector is not bound by that, and they can vote Republican.
It's almost never happened. It's almost never happened because they're also.
It can. Yeah. Okay, yes.
So there's a reason you are confused, and it's because the Electoral College operates differently in almost every state. But for the most part, I'd say, I think 32 states have laws on the books that require their electors to vote according to the majority in that state. And in the remaining states, I think it's done through party convention. So the party controls who is chosen to be an elector. And they enforce.
Is this where the media get their statisticians and numbers and the votes and is this how they, you know, when you're saying that they all have independent data analysts it kind of brings a rhythm to every election, that certain states will definitely be this and certain states will definitely be that, because all of those elements of the electors and the majority in the Senate or majority in the House of Representatives, it kind of gives you a picture of the voting patterns of those states, no?
So I think this doesn't require data analysts, it requires people analysts. The data analysts are there mostly for election nights because all of the different networks are trying to beat each other to get to the projections. And you know, projecting a winner while the votes are still being counted, that's a statistical problem. That's a statistical question. You know, what is the likelihood, given the patterns that we're seeing in different counties, that this person is going to be the winner versus that person? They get to a certain point, even before the votes are finished being counted, where they can have some certainty who's going to win. So that's where the data analysis comes in. But in terms of...
You know when they put the map on and they color it in red and blue?
Yes.
Right. And then they go, oh no, it's gone blue.
You know, always some dramatic music.
It's always been a red state. It's always been a red state. I'm sorry, Bob. I know. That's just what it is. Is it just for that? Have I summed it up well for the viewers?
Yes. So I think there is a little bit of theater involved in that. But you also have very responsible data analysts and statisticians who are trying to do it. It was tough this year because it was hard to know what the mail-in votes were going to look like. So it wasn't a typical election, but I think they did still do a very good job with the projections. But what you're describing, understanding how the state legislatures will operate and how different electors will operate, that has really never been a question mark up until this year. And I'll be honest, I don't think it's really a question mark. I think people have, you know, a lot of confidence that it's going to be done the way it's always been done. But because the election is being contested and because there are political forces that are trying to get electors to either shift or trying to get state legislatures not to certify the outcome of the election, it's, you know, produced question marks and endless opinion pieces and you know, fodder for media and pundits to talk about this. But I don't think anyone has a lot of doubt about how the Electoral College, when they meet on December 14th, I think we're pretty confident about what that is going to look like. But the reason it's getting so much attention is because it's a contested election. And so there's a lot of hypotheticals and trying to play out different scenarios.
Let's talk about that. What are the scenarios now, from now until, December 14th? What can happen?
But we'll go through 50
We're all
different.
sitting here still going, oh no, yeah, well, I'm red, I'm green, everyone's having a party, and we're sitting there going, hang on a minute, we don't know, people don't know, media still saying things, some people are tweeting things, a lot of speculation. So what are the scenarios? What can definitely happen? What can definitely not happen? What's the worst thing that can happen? Is there gonna be a hung government for 2 weeks and we're just gonna be chilling?
I don't believe that's the case.
Okay.
Right now, what's happening is states are certifying the votes.
Okay.
Now, if there is a delay in the certification of the votes, the meeting of the Electoral College was actually moved out. This was done months ago because we anticipated that given how slowly the vote counting was going to take place, there may be time that we may need additional time, because the votes have to be certified within the state before a winner is declared and electors are sent to the Electoral College. And so right now it's the certification processes that is underway. There are legal challenges that might delay certification in some states, but I don't anticipate that that's going to be enough to delay enough electors for the Electoral College. I don't want to go through all of the different scenarios. I'll go through, there is concern that the certification would be delayed and that would mess up the Electoral College. There's concern that you may have states that disagree on the designation of electors. This has come up in Pennsylvania, where there have been a lot of legal challenges. So you can get the state legislature certifying one thing, or not certifying, but the state legislator deciding to designate electors. Legally, that's possible. They can say that we're going to assign these electors based on the election night outcomes because we have concerns about the votes that came in after election nights. Again, I don't think that's likely. It is possible legally for that to happen, in which case Pennsylvania sends 2 different sets of electors to the Electoral College, and then there's a lot of confusion, and all of the election lawyers scratch their heads because we're not quite sure what happens in that case, except that January 6th, when this goes to the House of Representatives, we may still have an outcome that's not clear. So I think right now, those are the biggest concerns, that there could either be a delay in the certification of the votes or a legal challenge that would lead to a not very clear outcome in a pivotal state. I think both of those are really unlikely.
So the first thing that comes to mind now is what we've been consuming in terms of media about contesting the count because of the states, allowing counts after the dates or after the time it was counted, and that's what they're looking to resolve, or that's what they're contesting or challenging in certain places. Is that going to become completely, that line of conversation will be dead by December 14th?
So again, we're getting into really finicky matters of election law, but I will say every state, these challenges have fallen off because they're really tied to the law within those states. So you have states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where the state law made it so that you could not start counting the mail-in votes until election day. So that was the law there. In other states, you have to stop counting on election day. In other states, they started a week early or 10 days earlier, and then you have to stop counting. So
that's one way for making it really difficult for anyone to contest like that. They know what's coming. They're like, you know what?
It's confusing for people who live here and are trying to follow this as well. But so I think the most significant challenge right now is coming out of Pennsylvania, and I don't think it is going to make a difference in the end. The challenge there is that Pennsylvania, it was by law, they start counting mail-in votes on election day, and they continue receiving mail-in votes for 3 days after. And then there was a Supreme Court decision that they could extend one deadline by 2 days, and so they ended up extending the mail-in votes also by 2 days. And then the Supreme Court came back and said, no, you only had those 3 days. Now what happened there though is what the court said is set those votes aside. They didn't say you can't count them. You say those votes that where there's legal ambiguity, set them aside. let's count all of the votes that we don't disagree on first, and let's see if we need to have that battle. Let's see if we need to even have that fight. And what we're seeing in Pennsylvania is that there are enough votes there that those votes that were set aside won't make a difference. So in a case where there is some ambiguity, they set the votes aside to figure out, are the margins close enough where we really need to have this legal battle because the law is somewhat ambiguous on this issue. There are not a lot of cases like that, and I think Pennsylvania is probably the most challenging.
So this brings me to another element that I want to talk about, which is the judiciary system. If it all, doesn't clear itself up by January 6th, is that when is the independent judiciary coming in? If there is something if there's no decision made, does it fall on the Supreme Court to make a decision? How does it, when the laws and policies don't work or don't conclude or give us a conclusion, who steps in?
No, it won't be the judiciary that decides it. I think, yes and no. So the courts have been a part of this from minute one. From before the election day, the courts have been a part of this and adjudicating what methods are admissible and not, and different layers of the courts. Again, we have state courts, federal courts, different levels of court involvement as well. So they've been involved at every stage. The court will only decide what comes before it. So the Supreme Court doesn't decide who becomes president. The Supreme Court can consider a case that comes before it about the validity of votes or the validity of certain ballots. So in 2000, when people say the Supreme Court decided the outcome, the Supreme Court only decided the outcome of a case that was before it about whether or not these ballots that were in question were admissible. The court doesn't decide who the winner is. So once all that has gone through and the legal process has worked its way, then there should be a winner. There are still areas of ambiguity. And so if there is still ambiguity in the Electoral College, it moves to the House of Representatives for a decision. So it's still a popular assembly that would be making the decision, not according to the popular vote, but according to state delegations.
So this year has brought on so many things, and I fail to wonder what it would have been like had it not been an election year, if Corona happened last year, and we were now sitting here towards the end of the Corona pandemic. But it has taught us a lot. And do you think that because of the year that we've had, these patterns in certain states that we talked about, the blues and the reds that turned, and the voting patterns and the was it 2020 that made these patterns change? Do we owe it to 2020 to give it the credit and say this year has made people rethink a lot of things, or made the country kind of, just from the media that we receive for like maskers and anti-maskers, there's just so many things that are coming at you. And that would make anyone kind of judge do you think a lot of the things that happened in the election is partly because of all of the events that happened in 2020?
I think COVID 2020 had an absolute impact, but I don't know if it impacted for one side or another. I don't know if there was, I think one of the interesting things that came out of, we do these exit interviews for voters as they come out of the voting booths. And a lot of the exit interviews showed that COVID was really important for Democrats and not for Republicans. So voters are voting for different reasons, and they're motivated by different things. So the ineffective COVID response was really important for Democrats. For Republicans, they were really concerned about the economy and the repercussions of COVID. I think the lasting impact of COVID is, first of all, that we had this move to advanced voting, both a lot of early voting and mail-in voting. And I think that was a big part of driving out voter turnout, voter registration and turnout, which is the highest in US history, almost 20% higher than just the last election. So almost 150 million citizens voted, and that's really astonishing. And I think a lot of it had to do with the different mechanisms you could use for voting. So I think the impact of 2020 isn't really on the political outcome as it is on changing the mechanisms of voting. But the political impact, it's hard to say one way or another, and I think we'll be trying to figure that out for a long time.
I've just been told that we don't have many questions from the audience, so it means that we can get to chat. Yay. One thing I want to talk about is, because you mentioned voters, voting, voters, voting, voter rights, and who can and who can't, and where does the law come into who, like, for example, now the mail-in ballots, right? That's being contested, and it needed this decision to say, right, let's leave them on the side for now. Everyone carry on as you were, and we'll figure this out later. And then that having a result is something. But who gets to vote, and how do you register, and where do you? I mean, this is also something that we get on, because if you follow the media, that there's a lot of also education to Americans about voting rights. It seems like there's still a push and constant communication for either turning out to vote or how to register to vote, or, there was in the last election and this one, certainly, we felt that there's a lot of communication of it. Now is the time to vote. You have to register to vote. If you don't know how to vote, this is how you register to vote. Go on this website, learn how to, you know what I mean? Is it, I mean, for me, I live in a different country with a different, like completely different, okay? But I'm still interested, and I still want to know, and I still feel like I need to know because of the implications of all of these decisions that have on the world. I mean, it's a world economy, right?
So there was a big public education campaign this year, probably more than any other year, about make a plan, figure out how you're going to vote, because there were so many changes, especially mail-in voting. There had to be a lot of information about how this was going to happen. And again, that one of the challenges is that it's different in every state. So the education aspect was really important to communicate to people. And it is different. Who can vote is US citizens above the age of 18. But then you get into some tricky areas where in some states, felons are disenfranchised. People who have records of felonies don't have the right to vote. In most states, they do. In some states,
whatever it is that they have,
yes.
Regardless of the crime, really? Like, or is it?
No, it's not regardless. It is. It's a category of a crime that disenfranchises them. Okay. And these are things that get a lot of attention and criticism in those states. There are other places where voter ID laws are questioned, and voters are turned away because it's not clear what is actually required. There's some ambiguity, and in most states there are no requirements for voter ID. There are some states where you can register the day of the election and go and vote in that day. In other places, you need to have registered 30 days in advance, 60 days in advance. In some states, you have to have established your residency in that state for a certain amount of time before you can vote. So there's confusion that comes in. The easy answer is US citizens above the age of 18. That's easy. But then when you get into this, fine, really, these details, you realize that very small changes can have a really dramatic impact on voter turnout and who actually comes out. Really, election laws, the tiniest change can have a really significant impact, which is why you have voting rights organizations and voter advocacy organizations that are out there trying to make sure that people are informed and they've done what they need to comply by their state's regulations. And we have also lots of election monitors to make sure that when people show up at the polls, that they are either given the right to vote, or if there are any questions, that they're given provisional ballots. And these provisional ballots are reviewed later to make sure that, that they were in fact allowed to vote in that district, or that their name matches the names on the voter polls. So there are lots of organizations and there are lots of efforts by state election administrators to make sure that those who have the right to vote are able to exercise it. But I'll say just one thing, because I think it's important to clarify. We talk about the right to vote in these very abstract terms. What the US Constitution guarantees is that you will not be discriminated against in voting, but there's no actual right to vote in the US Constitution. There are election laws that say you cannot discriminate against people. So if the ability to vote is granted to one group, it has to be granted to others. You can't discriminate in the exercise of voting. But there's no inherent right to vote that is put in place in the Constitution.
So, do you think that this is the system that was envisioned when the Constitution was, is this when the Constitution was being written, was it leading us to here? Was the democratic process the goal, or how did we get here?
I don't think there's any way they could have envisioned what is in place right now.
I don't know how to take that. Your eyes just went, ooh, and I'm like, okay, there's a question I'm not asking.
Was devised for a very small country, a small group of electors. At the time, it was not even that all men could vote. It was a very small group of people, property owners, and I think that was what it was devised for. But I think we should be careful. I'm someone who cares a lot about history, and I study history. But the reason that institutions were put in place are not the reasons they endure, and it's not how they operate today. So I think what the founders had in mind, I think they had in mind a democratic constitution, but a democratic constitution that weighs lots of different principles. People think democracy just means majority rule. Well, it can mean majority rule, but it can also incorporate the federalist principles, consensus building principles. So it's a democracy that weighs lots of different checks and balances, minority protections. There are lots of counter-majoritarian measures that are put in the Constitution that help protect even those who are not in the majority. And those are all part of, in my mind, a democratic and Republican Constitution. So did they imagine that in 2020, we would be arguing about mail-in voting? Probably not. But I think it is a system that is meant to change and meant to adapt to different circumstances.
It certainly has. There's one thing that's always been kind of, I'm sitting in the Arab world, and we all know what the Arab world's like. It's hot, for one. That's probably why I never do anything. It's too hot to get out of the house. There is a part of us that I don't know if it's in my lifetime or not, that we will have some kind of democratic or, engage in some kind of democratic governance in some place in this region. I don't know, but we'll see. But one thing is, there's a huge diversity in America. There's so many Americans, Arab American, Irish American, Italian American, Asian American. There's always American. And that's one thing that kind of, from me on this side, where the definition of American, depending on who's saying American, becomes redefined and reshaped. And that becomes a dialogue where it almost is, it's not a conversation, it's a dictation at each other, where you have identities and groups, and when you have an America, like one thing, and then you try and break it apart, you go, oh no, this is Arab American, this is Indian American. You have one thing, the brand America, if you want to even call it that, right? And what it's given and what it's created. At a point, where we are in a period of history that is crazy. Like we have tech that allows us to tell you where everyone else is and what they're doing and what kind of food they like and what patterns of thinking they have and where they can sell them the next ice cream, at what point they will buy this bag, and all of these things that we have. And then when it comes to a discourse of a nation, it's coming down to what part of the nation you identify with rather than the nation, And sometimes for us, for me at least, thinking when we're sitting in a constitutional monarchy, it's like, great, the rules are set, bro. You know what I mean? We all know what the rules are. Peace, let's go. This is Qatar, these are the rules, this is the game, this is how it's played, Whereas the growing up and you're consuming and you're part of, you're American without being American, but you identify with a lot of the stuff and I mean, we all use the same solutions, the same tech, the same lifestyle, the same shows, we consume the same media, But then when it comes to this specific discourse around the politics now, it's like, who's voting for what? To me, it's like, it's not America anymore. It's not, I'm not trying to sound like, that there is one only definition of what of course not. There's different debates, but I feel like we're at a point where it matters who says America, how they say America, and when they say America, rather than, this is where we should be going. And when you have systems in place like a state level and a federal level and a communal level, sometimes I feel like that is double-edged sword, something that starts in a community can then become something, you build a beast at some point,
So let me try to respond as much as I can, because I think you're onto something really important that people have been talking about a lot, and let me know if this is along the lines of what you're thinking. What we hear a lot now is that partisanship and polarization, tribalism is really pushing people against democratic values, that everyone is just fighting for their own party, their own self-interest, their own material well-being, and maybe the democratic ideals that we think are necessary to hold up democracy are no longer in place. So I think that is a little bit of the narrative, but I try to push back against that in a couple of different ways. It's one of the reasons I began studying US history and European history. I actually started off studying for the Middle East for my PhD. And then as I got into my studies, I realized that we talk about democracy in other places, and we have very little understanding of how democracy came into place in the United States and in the countries that are now established democracies. We have these stories in our head, and we have a few classical texts, but we don't really know a lot about the nitty gritty of how these democracies came into being. So that's how I set off on this course, and I, along with a group of other scholars, have been really focused on this history. And what the history tells us is that this idea that polarization is new, this idea that hyper-partisanship is new, that's just unfounded. Even the racial antagonisms, the ethnic antagonisms, these groups that now consider themselves hyphenated Americans were excluded through the history. But also looking at the history tells us that it's not a linear path to progress. And democracy doesn't require us to give up on disagreement, or doesn't require us to give up on different identities. All it requires really is that we have an acceptance and tolerance for contestation, for competition, and that we are willing in that competition to accept losses and to say, okay, 4 years, in 4 years we'll come back. We still don't like you, we still don't think you're in our best interest, but we're gonna come back in 4 years because the system itself is valuable enough. That's really what it comes down to. It's, can you keep this system of competition going? It requires different sides. You don't need to have a uniform identity. You don't need to have a uniform party. It actually would contradict democracy. The issue really is, can you keep competition going? And there have been times in the history of the United States where that's been very challenging. And there are times when groups have been excluded from politics, sometimes permanently. It's not this linear, path to progress.
Yeah. Is it always a case of history repeating itself at some point and that we're just creatures of habit?
I think, for new groups, as you come to the United States, it does feel a little like history is repeating itself. But it would almost be easy if history were repeating itself, because then we would have a playbook. We could look back to history and say, oh, this is what happened, so we can do this now. But it's not that easy. History.
Well, there are lessons in history, from political lessons in history, that are a playbook. I mean, we all know what bad things history has brought us, and we all know if there's someone going to go do this thing and try and become the tyrant leader of this land, and we know that that's not going to be a good thing. We just look back 70 years ago and see how many millions of people had to die for, when regimes like that are born.
But how you adapt those lessons for a different context, it's always going to be a different context. We can look back.
What the democratic process guarantees is that you won't have one person who can, flip it over for eternity and become the ruler of all man. That's what the competition is for, no?
Yes, democracies can also succumb to one-party rule. I don't really think that there is such a thing as a consolidated democracy that we don't have to worry about anymore. I think there are conditions. We know that the longer a democracy has been in place, the stronger it is, the more likely it is to continue. But there are always conditions that stress democracy past the point. This issue of competition. It requires that people accept that they're not going to perish if they let the other side win. So the stakes cannot be so high that you think accepting losses is going to mean permanent damage for you or your family, your ability to live and eat. And there are really, there are economic stresses. There are all sorts of stressful situations where democracy can succumb. So I'm not saying that there are situations that are beyond this. There are definite stressful situations. I think, the COVID crisis is stressing a lot of democracies. Economic crisis is always a stress on democracies. So I don't think we should ever be cavalier with how strong a democracy is in the face of these threats.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for explaining what the Electoral College is to me and to everyone watching, because I finally have an answer. Let me just check one last thing if we have any questions. Okay, we have one question from the audience on Facebook. How long till they kill the Electoral College, throw out the all or nothing tally system, and go to a four-party system, i.e. left-leaning Dems versus more centrist Dems and far-right versus moderate Republicans? Huh? I hope you understood more of that question. I guess he wants to split the two-party system into four, and then
I get a variation on that question almost every day.
Yeah, okay.
I'll say I have no crystal ball, but I would say the Electoral College is not going anywhere. I think if you look at the history of most democracies, in the US in particular, the only time you get changes to electoral systems is when there's a threat to both parties. So you got this in the 1840s with the rise of workers' parties. But today, it's too much of a zero-sum thing. Changing the Electoral College will always benefit one party and not another. So I don't think, under the current circumstances, since you need a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College, I don't think that's realistic. But I would also say the Electoral College is not what is keeping in place the two-party system. It's the majoritarian nature of the elections, which would be there even if we went with a popular vote.
Yeah, I learned that from you today. that it's, money and popularity, as you said. You could be, to a certain extent, if you really want to get it going, to get a head start, it's all about the Almighty dollar, baby.
That is part of your campaign.
Yeah, I'll run a mile. That's all I'm good for running. That's about it, and then I'm done.
That's not
Well,
fast.
thank you so much, and I wish you have a great day. For me, it's bedtime. So thank you for everyone watching on Facebook and for everyone getting involved on our social media. Thank you once again, Dr. Ahmed. It's been a pleasure. And to everyone, good night. See you on another edition of Swalif with me, Hamad Amari. Bye-bye.
Thank you.